Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. This is the second of our deep dive international webinars for the Theatre Green Book. I'm Laura, the producer for Theatre Green Book. And for anyone who doesn't know, this is part of a webinar series that we've designed looking at areas of the Theatre Green Book and sustainable working, just in a bit more depth. And inviting speakers and experts from across Europe and inviting out to a whole Theatre Green Book international community. So thank you very much for joining. Very briefly on the housekeeping, if anyone would like to use the Zoom captions, they are available. If you go along the bottom, you should see a little button with CC in, and if you can't see it, if you click the three dots, it'll come up. This session is being recorded just because we've got so many people in other time zones that we're then able to share it with those people who can't make it in person. Please do keep yourselves on mute while the speakers are talking, but feel free to put any questions as you think of them in the chat, and we will come to them at a suitable moment. And thank you very much to everyone who filled in the survey in advance. So we have a few questions as well that have been pre-sent in. So now I will hand over to Paddy, who is hosting today's session. And Paddy Dillon is the co-founder of Theatre Green Book and is part of Renew Culture. Over to you, Paddy.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks all of you for joining us this afternoon. We've known from the very first conversations around the Theatre Green Book that sustainable theatre is fundamentally a creative challenge. There's nothing surprising about that. Everything in theatre is fundamentally a creative challenge. If we want to make our productions more sustainably, we have to conceive of them in more sustainable ways, and that goes right back to the artists on whom we depend. But of course, that can put a great burden on those artists, on our designers, and on our directors. Sustainability can seem to them like a restriction. There are things I used to be able to do that I can't anymore. It can, and we've had many conversations about this, feel like a limit on their creative freedom. On the other hand, if creative artists in theatre don't conceive of shows in more sustainable ways, we know that that puts an impossible burden on the production and making teams for each show. We can't go on thinking the way we always did and then simply pass a model or a design over to the workshops and expect them magically to make it sustainable. So this question of how to work with creative teams if we want sustainable outcomes is a really fundamental one, and it's one of the questions that comes up most often when we visit and talk to theatres working with the Theatre Green Book. So we've brought together this afternoon a really fantastic panel to talk about this. Tom Piper is one of the UK's most experienced, most respected, most fantastic designer, really well known for his work with the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Kiln, but with many, many other projects as well. Het Zuidelijk Toneel in Tilburg in the Netherlands is one of Holland's most dynamic and creative theatre companies. Hilke Bastiaansen from their planning and coordination team has been part of the artistic leadership of Zuidelijk Toneel, and she's going to talk from that point of view of artistic direction within a company. Meanwhile, Paul Handley, technical director of the National Theatre, has been not only an instrumental figure in the creation of the Theatre Green Book, but has also been living, as it were, on the front line in the National Theatre's fantastic drive towards making big, ambitious shows in more sustainable ways. I'm going to ask each of them in turn, starting with Tom, to present a bit about their work and their experience in this question, and then we'll move from there to a more open conversation between the three of them before throwing the question open to the floor with about 15 minutes time at the end, we hope, for questions. So Tom, would you like to give us a bit of your experience in this question?
Hello, everybody. Very delighted to be here. I was the associate designer at the Royal Shakespeare Company for 10 years in 2004 to 14, and I've done over 55 productions there. So I thought I would share some pictures because that's always fun. And so hopefully this will work, having tried it out earlier on. I just have to find the right keynote, which has miraculously disappeared as always at this precise moment. So hang on. That's the wrong bloody product. Excuse me. Oh, here we go. Right. Sorry about that. Okay. So as you can see, I'm a bit old school. So what I'm going to do is talk to you very quickly about the Tempest at the RSC, which we attained intermediate Green Book status on, and then the Purist at the Kiln. And I guess one of the things that really for me begins it is that creative discussion with the director. And in this particular production, Elizabeth Freestone, who was the director of the Tempest, wanted to bring an ecological story of disaster and renewal to the whole production. So actually that fed into the initial discussions about how this world might be staged. So we looked at a series of images that were very familiar to people, but of marine pollution, mounds of flip-flops arriving on pristine beaches, oil spills that then lead to the terrible degradation of animals and birds. And so all of this was sort of part of our kind of initial discussion before we even get into the concept of how we realize the production. Then looking at the kind of world that Prospero might live on the island, kind of abandoned makeshift environments. And also because we were staging it in a theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon, what would happen if in a way the theatre was itself destroyed by an environmental catastrophe, you know, maybe massive flooding or whatever. Broken down pianos are always great. And then looking at lots of images of places like Detroit, where you get decay, but then the sense of renewal. So how can you create a story that is actually a positive story in the end about how there is a chance for regrowth, renewal, redemption, which in a sense is what the Tempest sort of illustrates. It begins as a revenge tragedy, but then actually becomes a tale of forgiveness and acceptance. So backtracking slightly, I'd also just before this been working on a production called Gull and Nauta at the Kiln Theatre. And as I knew I was working on this show with Elwan, I talked to the production manager at the Kiln, Nikki, and the production manager of the show at the RSC, the Tempest, about whether there were elements of this production that we could recycle between and take from one theatre to another. So in this case, there was a whole series of burnt timber walls, which themselves were a recycled wall that was then charred, and texture and flooring, which wasn't so sustainable, but we were able to kind of reuse it. And then also within productions, as a kind of photograph, there was a set of gold polycarbonate mirrors that we had to buy for it. But I thought, you know, how can we recycle them and use them? Another production I'd done with the same director, Elizabeth Freestone, was in Wilton's Music Hall, where we sourced reeds, we sourced rubbish from the seaside, we sourced driftwood to kind of create the structure. And all of these, again, I said, can we take those to the RSC to make the Tempest show? So my model for the Tempest, again, recycling quite a lot of bits from my previous models. So you had the walls there that you can maybe see that came from that Girl on Nauta show at the Kiln. The proscenium arch had been in a production Midsummer Night's Dream I'd done. And so it kind of wanted to create the sense of a theatre space that had been abandoned, that was flooded with rubbish. This is a kind of photograph of the finished show with the walls kind of recycled, or the costumes recycled, very much going into the method acting of the actors wanting to kind of actually have a real backstory to where their clothes had come from, how they'd sourced them, how we adapted them. So for example, Prospero's magic jacket was made out of her life jacket and repurposed. And then Caliban has a kind of famously has a gabardine where I wanted to reuse kind of flip-flops and create a sense of a kind of fishing net of rubbish that he hid underneath oops, sorry, went the wrong way there, which, oh, it's going the wrong way, it's going the wrong way, go the right way, which then became the cloak for the clowns. And gradually, as the production went on, more and more of this rubbish was sort of cleared away. One of the huge challenges creatively in any kind of trying to reuse and repurpose in something way was a contemporary production. We needed very good looking costumes for the nobles. So in a sense, and also because of the working conditions of the RSC and cleaning and stuff, we needed duplicates and sometimes triplicates of these items, which meant that we had to source them from new, but try to go not to fast fashion sources, but to other ones. But again, I think that's an area which was a real challenge that we kind of fell down on. For the moment of the harpy in the Tempest, using that oiled bird as a kind of metaphor, and then recycling this mirror that kind of bled oil for it. That's the kind of mirror there. And then for the goddesses that appear within the play, and inspired by Inigo Jones' drawings, creating their costumes again entirely out of rubbish and recycled materials, which are then stripped off them to do a much more kind of free-fall natural thing. And as the play went on, gradually more and more of the rubbish was kind of stripped away, so that with a symbol of kind of regrowth and renewal, by the end of the piece, we revealed an entire forest growing at the back of the theatre. So it sort of ended up looking like that for the final thing. So you've gone from this kind of destroyed world to a world where regrowth was possible. And I do think that's important, that we do try and tell positive stories. And there you can see the stats of how we did on that show. In a much more smaller space, going back to the kiln, this is an example of the Purists, where I worked recently trying to create the set out of scaffolding. We're using steel deck for the flooring, painting graffiti directly onto the walls using water-based paints. And also another thing I really value about the Green Book is actually therefore employing real people to do the work rather than getting something printed up. We actually got graffiti artists in to paint the space. So that's kind of how that show ended up. And I think this ended up with kind of like a basic level of Green Book. So there we go. Very quick little whiz through a few examples of stuff, but hopefully, I'm trying to stop sharing now. There we are. Hopefully kind of interesting. Thank you. You're on mute.
Muted myself. Thanks so much for sharing those fantastic looking shows. It's really great when I think back to some of our early conversations about the Theatre Green Book, when at one point it felt as if working sustainably would be bound to mean working minimally with bare stage shows and so on. So to start seeing visually really rich and complex work being made to a very high standard of sustainability is just a really exciting moment. Paul, you're on the, as I said before, you're on the front line of the conversations with creative theatre makers in trying to make sure that as many of the National Theatre's shows as possible are hitting high standards for sustainability. What's your experience of doing that?
Well, what I've learned just now is if we could employ Tom the whole time, this would all be a breeze, and we'd make fantastic work. As you say, Paddy, to see the sort of richness, and they just don't look compromised, any of those designs, which is incredible. And the message that we keep trying to send here, that it's not about minimalism, it's not about compromise, it's just about thinking in a completely different way. There is no question that if you have the buy-in of your freelance artists, principally director and designer, then actually it can become a really joyful, creative experience, and actually relatively straightforward. However, it's not as easy as that, as I'm sure most of you experience. And part of that, I think, is systemic. In this country, certainly all our artists are freelance, and us in the buildings are privileged enough and paid to in fact have these conversations all day long. We ask our freelance artists to come in and make their very best work, or we won't employ them again. I don't mean it quite as crudely as that, but that is the pressure on a freelancer in terms of thinking about future work. And of course they just want to come in and make their very best work using the maximum of the resource you have available. We center the Theatre Green Book and our environmental ambitions in the very first conversations we have with all our artists. It is actually enshrined in contracts for directors and designers that they must work with us to achieve the Theatre Green Book standards. But it's really a real emphasis on collaboration, actually, because that's what this is. It's a wholly collaborative process that can't just depend on one or two people, can't depend on the director alone, can't depend on the designer alone, and it really can't depend on the production manager alone. It has to be a joined up process. And I mean, I should say at the National, we're having a lot of success with it. We produced 15 to 18 shows a year, and then in the last calendar year, we achieved 4 shows at intermediate level of the Theatre Green Book. We missed the set by a couple of % on a couple of the other shows. Otherwise, they're all basic. And we had one flat out disaster with the set, which was really, frankly, to do with the buy-in of the artistic team. But even that wasn't a total disaster. The props and costume side of that production were really successful. In fact, costume and props often end up in the kind of 60–70% of reuse. And I think what is fantastic is the extent to which all our teams on the ground, so whether that's carpenters, metal workers, prop buyers, prop makers, all of the production teams are really bought into this and feeding in lots of ideas and prepared to do the additional bit of work, which is just recording all the data about the decisions they've made and where things come from. And of course, we appreciate that at the National Theatre, we're blessed with a reasonable, there's never enough people or stuff or time, but we do at least have a level of a decent administrative support to do all of that stuff. It obviously works best when the artists are completely on board with it and open to really a latitude of thinking. That's a word I use quite a lot with the artists, is that we've always been very focused in this business in really within the usual restrictions of budget and time, delivering exactly what's in the mind's eye of the artists involved. And what we ask for in this agenda is some latitude in that, so that you can move to the left or right of that original idea in order for it to be more environmentally friendly and involve a certain amount of reuse. It can be an utterly joyful process. It can be an utterly painful process. I would say more often than not, it does land on the production managers to really drive this and make it work. But we have a lot of empathy, sympathy with the artists coming into the building, because anyone who is an artist will know it's no easy task to make new, exciting, original, innovative work. And so we have to meet in the middle. We have to meet halfway. The National Theatre is, you know, we're still relatively early days, even a few years on, of working with the Theatre Green Book, of developing our resource, so that when a design and director team comes in, we can be crystal clear about the frameworks of support we can offer them in hitting our Green Book standards. To that purpose, we've been lucky enough here to sign a lease on some storage, which is close by, 45,000 square feet of space, which holds our existing costume and props hire business, but which doesn't commercially pay for the property, and the majority of the work with our costume and props business is serving our internal program, our productions here. The other half of that facility is for technical equipment and scenic resources and engineering resources, and we're only just getting to grips with thinking about what we keep, what we don't keep, and what is really going to make that resource attractive to artists coming into the building. we more or less insist that every team that comes in pays a visit to that store. It's nearby. The costume and props are very well presented, so actually very attractive and is drawing a lot of press at the moment. Making the technical equipment and scenery side of it is attractive and clear to the artists in terms of what's there to use or not use is taking a little more work. But it's brilliant to have it on our doorstep, and we're also lucky enough to be sponsored to have a fully electric HGV to be able to drive it back and forwards from the building. So in terms of closing in on the circular economy, each year that goes by, we are making it easier and easier. But unquestionably, that's come with, resource, whether it's fundraising help or just our own investment in capital and stuff. So we want to develop that shop front a lot more. We're working with the Mayor's office here in London to work on a scheme that really dives deep into the recycling of scenery. We're making a lot of modular scenery here, much more than we used to before. It's still at a point of innovation. I think we're on version 6.5 of modular flattage that does all the things we need it to do. But I think our staff are really enjoying that innovation and the freedom to try things, accepting that not everything will work and it will keep developing. There's no instant solution to all of this. And of course we do, we try new products as well. It's complicated in theatre because we need those products to do so much for us. Fire retardancy, not least of that. And that makes it hard to substitute a lot of the things we use. But, we work very closely when the freelancers come in. I think one of the big problems we face is that freelance artists often need to be balancing more than one job at a time in order to make a satisfactory annual income. And what the green agenda really demands more than anything is time. So that's a constant negotiation. The more time, the more advanced designs we have, the more advanced the conversation, the easier the process becomes, and frankly more enjoyable rather than the usual, which I'm sure many of you are used to, a sort of last minute scramble to respond to designs and get things on stage in time. So time is definitely our friend, the greatest friend of all. I don't think it necessarily means you have to have bigger budgets. In fact, eventually the amount of reuse we're putting into shows might mean that organizations can lower their budgets. We'll see how that goes. It's really at this point a question of where you put your resource and how you spend your money. I think Tom will probably get into a conversation shortly about how we all join up in the sharing of assets. What we know in the UK is that there's a huge stockpile of theatre assets that sit languishing in different stores across the country. And so one of the big challenges of the next couple of years is how we join all those assets together and make them visible to the artistic community and production management community in order that they can be used more effectively and efficiently. So we're not there yet. Our ambition is high. We want to be making advanced standard shows by 2030, and we're trying to put all the building blocks in place to be able to achieve that. We offer carbon literacy training to all our artistic teams coming in. We at some point would like to make it compulsory, and of course we will pay the artists to do that training, but just so they have some grounding in this, and so it's not a real shock as they come into the building that we're all talking about this stuff that they've only just started to engage in. So I think, just to summarize, the challenge ahead is to meet our freelance artistic community halfway, so that the burden doesn't sit on them, and doesn't just sit on us either, but is a beautiful collaboration, as we all know, is the best way to make theatre.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. That's so great to get your experience of this. I'm really interested, and I'm sure we'll come back to it later, that you touch on how important the very first conversation is, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But first, I'd like to go to Hilke Bastiaansen from Het Zuidelijk Toneel, in the southern Netherlands. And it would be great, Hilke, if you could talk us through a little bit about the work of Zuidelijk Toneel, and also how you, as you're planning, coordinating, putting together programs, starting to work with artists, how you make sure that they are helping you to achieve your values and your sustainability targets.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paddy. So first about het Zuidelijk Toneel. So we are based in the south of the Netherlands, and we're a pretty small company. So we work with around 30 people on the floor, and then we create around 6 productions a year. Sarah Moeremans, she's our artistic director, and she's the big drive behind us using the Theatre Green Book. She was supposed to sit here today, but she unfortunately couldn't make it due to personal circumstances. So that's why I jumped in. The 3 pillars of het Zuidelijk Toneel are fun, fiction, and future-proof. So those 3 things are really important to us, and that's actually where it starts when Sarah started looking at who do I want to work with, which directors are we going to invite to have a conversation with for the next 4 years. She really took that into account into the conversations that she had with those people, with those directors. So from the start, it was already clear to them that this was going to be the path that we were going to walk, and that they were going to have to work with the Theatre Green Book. And I think that really helps with getting your team along, because it's clear from the start. And then the fun factor comes in as well. So Sarah really sees it as a bit of a game, how she works. Instead of looking at that those guidelines or restrictions, it's more about how can we make this fun, and how can we put this into a sort of way of working where we find more creativity and find it more interesting to make everything future-proof. So she sat down with the directors, and she had a conversation on how can we achieve this, how are we going to work, and that's how she set out guidelines. So for this year, 2025, we are working just with a bit of smoke, sound, and light. So there is no other scenography, which is actually really cool. It's working out pretty cool. This Friday, we're premiering Holly Goosebumps. And it's a production that is all based on sound. So it's trying to integrate movie into theater. So it's a different way of working than putting the set like literally on stage. It's made way more in sound. And then next year, we will be working with 1 scenographer. And then we will use that set design for 3 different productions. So that's how we try to set up guidelines for ourselves to make it really clear. Like you set up a budget, time. This is also a bit of a playground where they can play in. And we do it all in conversation with the directors. So yeah, that's a bit about Zuidelijk Toneel.
Fantastic, Hilke. Thanks so much for that. I love that you're using words like fun and playground in relation to this, which also matches certainly when I visited you in Tilburg. That's very much the spirit of the whole company. Tom, if I can come to you with a question. Sometimes it feels as if there's a real split between the kind of creative conception and then the nuts and bolts of sustainable making, recycling plywood and so on. Is there a kind of creative way of thinking about reuse and recycling and circular economy? Is there something that joins the 2 together?
I think definitely, and I, in a way, go back to my early training, which was really very much in a student fringe theatre environment where I made everything from what I could get my hands on, be it in skips or renting scaffolding and scaffolding planks. And in a way, perhaps going even deeper, one of the things we should be looking at in training of future designers and creatives is how you can be resourceful with your ideas and to explore them with the constraint of, because it always used to be budget, money was always a constraint. So for me, actually, and finding creative solutions to the problem of money, actually finding creative solutions to the problem of sustainability is the same thing, really, and it's the same resourcefulness. And I really like what you were talking about, Hilke, about when you got one designer in to work for a season. I think for me, a lot of it is the relationships between the creatives and the organizations and trying to make sure that those build and cross-fertilize so that you really know your organization you're going into, you know what their resources are, and you can say, do you remember that tree that I did 5 years ago? Have you still got it? Can I reuse that? And one of the problems, certainly in the British theatre, has been that we've all become such freelance artists and we're no longer connected to our buildings or places of work. And I think that's the thing that has to be worked at the same time to create more relationships, associates. They don't necessarily need to be massively paid, but just trying to embed people back into the organization so that you can share the knowledge, and therefore it doesn't become a one, only this versus my creativity. You're actually working in tandem with that building and with what they have to offer. So a lot of things that I tried to do illustrating there was using all my connections across the country to go, well, get the production manager of the Kiln to talk to the production manager of the RSC and get them to share resources. I've even been on to Paul, which she wasn't able to do, to get him to take a whole load of wardrobes from one production that I've done. It was at the RSC, then it went to an installation at Waterston Manor, and then I discovered that I had a kind of a year-long gap where I could reuse that material again. And in the end, I'm afraid most of it got scrapped because it was cheaper to do that than to store it for a year. So storage and sharing is the big issue for me.
Brilliant, thank you. And next, I'd like to get your takes from your three rather different perspectives on, let's go to the very beginning, the very conception of a new show. And how do we set the ground so that we're most likely to achieve a sustainable outcome? I've noticed in the chat there's a question from Mona Rieken at Theater Dortmund about what's the right time to talk about this. And so let's go to that very first questions about how we make sure we are going to get a sustainable outcome. Hilke, you talked about who do we want to work with, and a very sort of primary question about making sure you're working with creative teams who share your values. Has it changed the list of people that you work with, that you do find yourself now moving towards designers and directors that you know will join you in the playground, if you like?
No, so the directors that we work with are set for the upcoming 4 years, but how it works is that the directors that we are working with this year are going to come back in 2027, so that we can come back to our learnings from this year in 2027. So they already experienced working with the Theatre Green Book. They know the challenges, and that's how we sort of working. So next year, 2026, they will come back in 2028. And I know Sarah is already, there is a meeting planned for 2027, what the guidelines will be for them for that year.
And so you're gradually building up knowledge within the artists that you're working with.
Exactly.
They're becoming more and more experienced.
Yeah, exactly.
And Paul, at the National Theatre, you're working with a lot of designers, a lot of directors. Is it realistic to say, if you want to work with us, you need to share our values, that you're only going to be choosing artists who are committed to working in sustainable ways?
Yeah. Yes, we're really clear that this is key to our values. It's not a nice to have. I mean, most people will say that they will commit to trying this out, even if they're not quite sure how they're going to do it. But we obviously give people the option to not work with us. If they don't want to work in this way, then go and work somewhere else. I haven't known of anyone choosing that option so far. But yeah, we're tough about it. It is absolutely a requirement of working with us. And again, it's reinforcing the collaborative nature of that. We don't pretend to have all the answers, and we don't pretend to think it all sits with the freelance artists that we employ. But as I've said before, it's one of the first things we say to them in the invitation. This is how we work. You will need to work with us this way.
And that point, in answer to Mona's question, getting it into the invitation right up front is fundamental to this, is it?
Yeah, it can't be an add-on. We mustn't pretend that this is easy. It's really not. It requires a real commitment, and it means thinking about things in a different way. We work with a very successful designer called Dillon, who said very clearly that you can no longer have an original idea as an artist anymore without thinking where the materials for that idea come from. Yeah. And of course, she's absolutely right, but that is a big shift away from the primary limit being imagination and budget. Yeah. So we have to acknowledge that this isn't straightforward, but that we absolutely demand that people work with us to solve it creatively, because in the end, it is a creative challenge as much as it is a technical challenge.
Yeah, I think one of the things you can do is really to make sure that you take the burden of the spreadsheet away from the creative team. I find that something that I'm really, in fact, I was trying to get before this the stats on the kiln show, and I was sent through the kind of thing, and I was going, oh my god, I'm so glad I didn't have to do this bit of it. So in a way, having someone who can interpret it for you as the creative person and go, have you thought about this material versus that material, not actually burdening you with, well, if you choose that one, it'll be that % or that %,
Yeah.
And the documenting of it as you go along that enables you to feel that actually you're not being constrained, you're actually being liberated and being presented with new and exciting options and materials that you haven't thought about before. That kind of thing is really great.
I was also very struck, Hilke, listening to you about the way in which you, in the sort of production team at Zuiderlinck Toneel, are rethinking the rules of productions. In other words, saying let's have a single set for a number of shows. How important do you think that's been in opening the doors to change, in enabling more sustainable outcomes?
Sorry, can you repeat one more time?
Yeah, well, I was really interested by the way in which you've rethought the way that you're producing. For example, by saying we're going to have a single set for several shows.
Yeah.
I'm going to change the question slightly. How have directors and designers responded to that?
Well, actually pretty good, because they are, we have the conversation with them. So they sit at the table with the designer. So they all go, so they sit at the table with the designer, they have a first conversation, then they go back, they have their own thoughts of what they want, what they would like to see, what their wishes are, and then they bring that back. So they have definitely have a say in how that it should look. So it's not something that we say like, okay, this is how we're going to work, but it's more a conversation that we're having with all of them, with the designers, directors.
And that suggests a kind of spirit of flexibility and collaboration.
Yeah.
It's a long way from some of the more hierarchical models that one has in theatre.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tom, as a designer, how do you respond to that? Is that something that's welcome to you in your working practice, to have a very collaborative and flexible approach? You're muted.
Yeah, a lot of that approach used to be what happened in, old school theatres in a way, in rep models, or when I was first at the RSC, there's a theatre there called the Swan, set up very much to present Shakespeare's contemporaries, so it's a thrust, beautiful space. And there will often be shared elements that would have to be shared across 4 shows with 4 different designers. So you'd have a discussion about what will the season floor look like for this season. Gradually, everyone's ambitions got bigger and bigger. Containers started appearing outside the building to store the set, got more and more expensive. And they ended up actually getting rid of that shared rep model altogether and going to individual runs. So actually, we've had moments where we've all been much more fleet of collaborative, shared discussions, and we've allowed ourselves to get a bit bloated. And actually, it's great hearing if you're going back to the notion of actually how can you be expressive. And also, you know, I was very lucky to start my career with Peter Brook's company. So you go, well, what is a beautiful empty space? And so much, you know, we need to be looking at that too, about how our theatre buildings are beautiful and functional in their most neutral form, so that actually they're beautiful spaces to be in without needing scenography.
So we've started the show. There's a creativity about the way in which shows might be produced that might go back to older models, which are more flexible, which are more collaborative. We've made sure that there's an invitation really early on. We've made sure that the artists share the values and share the commitment to sustainability. Once we're into the process, Paul, are there different ways of setting up the meetings, the conversations, the communication within a production, once you're in development, which can make it easier to achieve a sustainable outcome at the end?
I don't think it's necessarily a different structure of meetings that we've applied. It's just making sure that it's always an agenda item, that it just becomes natural, that it is part of all our decision making, that it's a filter that we have to go through. We have someone who runs alongside the production collecting data and a decision log about you know, the big environmentally impactful decisions we make, and we write a report at the end, an environmental impact report that goes out to the artists that work with us, and we've been logging them with the Theatre Green Book as sort of fairly basic case studies. But I think in the process it's a bit like and I don't always like the analogy of health and safety and this being similar to it, but occasionally that is useful. And in the same way that safety has to be at the front of a process and the front of every conversation we have about what we're going to do, it's the same with environmental impact. There's no question of that.
Does it make, I'm going to pick up a question from Celeste Carrasco, which is, how important is it that the artists you're working with have been trained? And I'm thinking, I suppose, of climate literacy training or familiarity with the Theatre Green Book. Does that make a difference once you're working together?
We obviously, we send a link to the Theatre Green Book and advise that our artists read it and are familiar with it and see what's useful in it for them. I wouldn't say it's utterly essential. You know, carbon literacy training in the end can be summarized as saying, make conscious decisions. Know that every decision you make about consumption has a carbon impact. So just do that with awareness. That would be the quickest way to summarize that training. I mean, it is really insightful, I think, and most people, we've got at least half of our staff here in the building, and that's a lot of people have been trained that way now. And it has impacted the way they make decisions. But you can come to this with minimal training, I think, and be guided by, certainly in this building, be guided by the knowledge of the people you're working with, all the crafts people.
And what level, Hilke, at Zuidelijk Toneel, what's the level of information that you give to artists you're working with? I'm picking up here a question from Jess Taylor.
So at the moment, we are not really giving them any trainings. It's more the production leader that is protecting and making sure that the right questions are asked. I don't know, like future-wise, if we would start doing it. I think it's more about being aware, being conscious, asking the right questions to the directors if they want something, if they have a request, seeing if they can do it in a different way. So that's how we are trying to work as best as we can now with the Green Book. And then we also have in the Netherlands, there's a pilot group that we work with, so with different theaters, different theater companies as well, that we can regularly catch up with. If there is a question, we can always drop it into that community as well.
So there's a kind of network which is on the journey together.
Exactly, and it's what we say is like we're learning by doing. Right. We don't know everything. We're trying to figure out everything as best as we can. But because we're such a small team, it's sometimes hard to also have the trainings and everything for everyone.
I want to switch, Tom, to a question, since we're sort of talking about the phase of concept and development of ideas, to a question about aesthetic and whether sustainability is driving us towards certain aesthetics. You showed us two shows which were very, very different in their look. They were both visually rich, but one was a sort of aesthetic of reuse that came directly from the idea of reuse of rubbish. The other was not. Do you feel that there's a challenge or a problem with the circular economy, that it does force you down certain aesthetic avenues or not?
Well, I suppose everything tends towards entropy. So it's always much easier to do a decayed built thing and then an even more decayed thing. Although actually that proscenium arch that you saw in The Tempest was then recycled in my box of delights, with the scenic artist going back into it and repairing it and making it much nicer again. So yeah, that is possible. I mean, I think, to be crude, it's difficult to be shiny, right. Shiny things tend to be, but then equally in the future, sort of amazing fungus-based products or things like that might kind of create things that we don't know about that will replace fossil fuel-based sort of products. One of the things that I also wanted to add into the discussion, which happens for mid-scale theatres where you don't have an in-house building facility, is that your designs go out and they get costed by a range of workshops. And actually only now just beginning to happen, but needs to accelerate much more, is that sustainability and how that workshop are going to build that set is assessed as part of the criteria of why you choose them, rather than them being the cheapest or whatever. And so therefore a company that will say, well, actually we've got, and then that company actually becoming active in taking back to the scenery that they've built to then use it. So those kind of things for me, are an important slight sidetrack. Yeah.
There's a question in my mind which came up, I think something in something you said, Paul, earlier on. You are, I think, at the NT now including a requirement for sustainability in your contracts. Of course, everybody would want collaboration, everybody to be working together to achieve sustainable outcomes. But how important do you think, as it were, to have the stick as well as the carrot? Has that turned out to be useful or not particularly?
Well, we haven't sued anyone yet for breach of contract, thankfully. I think stick is important to a degree. I think we have to make this really serious. If someone failed significantly on a safety thing, to go back to that parallel, then of course they would be heavily penalized for it. I think we've drifted for many years on this topic. We've done a lot of talking, but not enough doing. And I think that there needs to be a bit of stick. And I know it's contentious with some of the artists we work with, but it's the only way of really landing how serious we are about it. What it means in the future, I can't possibly say. In the end, we have to make successful theatre or our business fails. So we haven't really been tested yet on whether we would wholly reject a design because it hasn't quite met the standard, because obviously a lot of that work happens in the process of a production. So we're not actually 100% confident of the figures until, you know, very near to the show opening. I mean, we have a very good sense of it, and we do currently say if you don't hit it, you've got to go back and think again. But we don't necessarily have enough data at the point that you would perhaps reject a design to be able to do it on that basis. However, if someone was to, as we've had recently, really fail in hitting the standard, then we would feed back that their future employment in this organization would depend on them trying much, much harder the next time.
Yeah. And Hilke, at Zadelijk Toneel, do you include sustainability requirements in your contracts with artists?
We've started doing that just now. So, yeah.
And is that something, Tom, as an artist, that is it problematic for you, or is it something that you think of as normal now?
No, I'm very positive about it. It's slightly strange at the moment because obviously some theatres I go to will say we're going to try and do for Theatre Green Book Basic, and then I go into another theatre and say what are our standards that we're going for, and people go, well, we're not that interested, or you know, it's not met as a priority, and therefore you sometimes feel like a bit of a lone voice in an organisation going, well, you know, should we be sourcing that in that particular way, or still trying to design with Green Book in mind without anybody in the organization actually doing it. So this current set I'm doing has got a lot of scaffolding in it because that's, you know, hopefully a relatively sustainable solution. But there was no one telling me to do it. I was just doing it myself.
But it's a very good prompt to remind everyone that in the very early days of the Theatre Green Book, how much of the drive for this was coming from artists and designers as well. I'm just reminding everybody, because time is starting to run out, that if you've got any questions, do put them in the chat. There's one I'm going to come back to, but I want to make time to get each of you to answer one question. We know that there are shows that don't work. Everyone's been involved in shows that haven't worked out as sustainably as everyone had hoped. So, Paul, I'll start with you. I'm keen to ask what makes the difference. Those shows that didn't work out, that didn't come out as sustainably as they should have done, against the ones that sail through and reach intermediate level or whatever. What's the key difference? What can we learn from your experience of the shows that work and the shows that don't?
As I think I said right at the beginning of this, it's absolutely about the willing engagement of the freelance artist right at the beginning of this, and to really mean it, and not just expect it to be solved as a production issue. That means we can frankly breeze through this and still make excellent work, as I would hope a year of productions at the National Theatre proves. There doesn't have to be a compromise on aesthetic or scale or you know, intellectual concept. So that, I mean, that's really the fundamental lesson. But just to sort of go back on what I said before, I don't, you know, we are on a frontier here. There is still so much to learn. We really don't, no one here can pretend to have all the answers. Yeah. And so the conversation remains the most important thing rather than the numbers at the moment. And I think in a lot of these seminars, we end up quoting Samuel Beckett and talking about the need to fail again and fail better. And that absolutely needs to be the spirit. This needs to be a joyful creative challenge and not something that we endlessly feel oppressed by.
Fantastic, thank you. And Hilke, in your experience, what makes the difference between the shows that work and the ones that don't from a sustainability point of view?
Well, I actually agree with Paul that the conversation is the most important, and that we keep the fun in trying to search to produce in the most sustainable way that we can. Obviously, making theater, that's our core business. That's what's the most important, and we want to keep making theater, so we want to do it in the most sustainable way. But keeping the conversation, evaluating what went wrong. Sometimes you do things that you thought were the right thing and they weren't. But it's a lesson you learn.
Yeah, lessons learned. That's another really good thing to take away. Tom, the shows that you've done that worked and the ones that didn't, could you put your finger on what made the difference?
I think the creative leadership, like Elizabeth Freestone, the director I've worked with, who's doing an entire PhD on Shakespeare and sustainability. So it comes from that intellectual leadership, I think, and therefore also wanting to tell stories rather than about the theme, rather than simply it being the kind of the background thing. That's what worked for me.
Brilliant. Now we've got a few questions in. Let's just sweep them up. Some really good point from Branwen at Theatre Clwyd, an incentive for I've just lost it. An incentive for commitment and starting at the point of signature. Deandra, touring and sustainable tours. I think we won't have time to get to that today, but Laura, we might talk about doing a webinar about touring in future. There's an interesting point about IP. Tom, you've responded to it saying that you're happy for elements to be used as long as it doesn't copy the design. And I think I would add in that this is something that we've talked about a lot in Theatre Green Book world, but that in real life doesn't seem to be as large a problem as it seems theoretically. I don't know if designers would agree with that or not. I only advice on sustainability clauses in contracts. I think, Laura, with this, we've got something in the toolkit on the Theatre Green Book website, don't we?
I've just popped the link in underneath Iona's question. Yes, we've got some really brilliant suggestions that Royal Ballet and Opera shared.
Yeah, fantastic. Thomas, your question about intellectual property, I think we've covered. And co-production, that's one that we might just touch on now. Does it make it harder? Tom, perhaps I'll go back to you again. If you're working on a co-production, is there a lack of clarity about targets and goals that makes a difference to you as a designer?
I did one recently, and this is again an economic pressure in British theatre that nowadays most rep theatres are doing into 3- or 4-way co-productions. One of the downsides of that is the loss of in-house sort of skills. You're lucky though. One of your co-producers might be able to make the set. Another one might have a costume store you can use. Somebody else is purely receiving it. There becomes a lot of, sometimes might have 3 or 4 different production managers involved because each theatre will have somebody that they'll throw in. So you're dealing with lots of people and it's all very spread out. It can work quite well because in a way everybody's working to their skills. But for me, it has a huge danger of eroding the kind of, it's purely financial, but eroding the skills base of all of these theatres. And actually, the other thing, to be sustainable, we need to create local economies where people can work and create work and be employed there and not travel. So it's another kind of big thing that I'm really passionate about, is trying to get opportunities for people in mid-career in crafts to actually stay and embed in and learn in organisations and build that skill base up.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panel, because we've reached the end of our time. I think so many interesting things have come out of that. To do perhaps most of all for me with how important it is to set things up in the right way, whether that's to do with early invitation and clarity, whether it's to do with the spirit in which a production is created, or whether it's to do with thinking creatively about how you produce program shows. I was really struck, Tom, by one of the points that you made about how in the past we would often think about shows in more holistic ways rather than just as individual products. So some of those structural and ecosystem ways that we can set up to help us work more sustainably are really key. But perhaps most important of all is something that you've all touched on, which is that creativity and the joy in it and the joy of collaboration, which are so fundamental to this art form, are absolutely fundamental to succeeding in this challenge. So a massive thank you to Tom Piper, to Hilke Bastiaansen, and to Paul Handley for sharing your ideas. Thanks to all of you for coming, and I'll pass back to Laura just to finish us off.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Only final thing to say is if you'd like to join any of our future international deep dive webinars, I've just popped the link in the chat and it's on our events page. So hopefully see some of you there. And we will pop the recording on the website in the next couple of days, should you want to share it with any of your colleagues or anyone who couldn't make it today. Thank you very much.